So here we are for this session. It's called Cloud Operations using Microsoft Azure. My name is Nikhil Champur. I go by Nick. I am a software development lead on the product team for ArcGIS, primarily focused on ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise in the cloud. And so today I'm going to be talking about ArcGIS Enterprise on the Microsoft Azure cloud. It probably won't be as exciting as tonight's party, but I hope to make it interesting enough that you have some good takeaways at the end of it. So the agenda for today, we're going to quickly do an overview. Some of you are familiar with our offering, some of you may not, so I'll want to set context and set the stage for it. We'll talk about our strategy for enterprise on the cloud, what are your options in terms of deployment, and then for those of you who are sort of repeat attendees, you'll want to learn what's new since the last user conference with our releases with 10.6 and 10.6.1. We'll talk a little bit about some advanced scenarios with automation and upgrades. And then I'll leave you with some tips and tricks and a little teaser to wet your whistle about some of the planned work for the upcoming releases with 10.7 and 10.7.1. This is sort of customary. I like to do this as a traditional thing. Can I do a quick survey of a few quick questions? If you could just raise your hands in terms of your role within your organization. How many of you would consider yourself purely developers? A few hands. I know GIS people, we tend to wear multiple hats, so feel free to raise your hand multiple times. IT administrators, a lot more. Okay. How about just GIS administrators? Wow. Okay, that's the majority. And the last one, I guess, is more in terms of your role, managerial positions. Oh, most of you. Okay, that's good to hear. So then just a show of hands, how many of you are directly responsible for the installation, the upgrade, and the management of ArcGIS Enterprise? That's 80% of the room, right? How many of you are already using the cloud today? Okay. Makes sense, you're in the cloud session. How many of you are getting started, planning to in the next 6 months? Okay, more people. Right. And some of you, it's more far out, long-term plans. Few hands. Okay, that's good to hear. How many of you already used our Cloud Builder before? Interesting. Okay, so this seems to be an audience that's fairly new to this, so that's good. I have some context to be able to set, the right content, if you will. Okay, with that, let's get started. So, quick overview, right? So, what is it we're trying to achieve? So, if you were to ask folks on the ArcGIS Enterprise team, this is our mission statement. Our mission really is to make deploying and managing your ArcGIS Enterprise on Azure as seamless as possible. That's really our mission, and that's what we strive for. So how do we go about achieving that vision? So it is a two-pronged strategy. The first one is we provide ready-to-use virtual machine images. So these machine images come with the software pre-installed, so you don't have to worry about that. The virtual machine images are available in all of the regions that Azure is in. So the 54 different regions or countries that they're in, they're available for you. They're also available in the US government cloud, also known as Fairfax in that environment. The only two regions it's not available is the Azure Germany and Azure China, which are known as sovereign clouds. And those aren't environments that are considered easy to work with compared to public Azure. And then the second part of the strategy is to make it easy for you to deploy and manage your ArcGIS Enterprise deployments. And for that, we provide a tool known as Cloud Builder. And as you will see later, we also support automation through Cloud Builder and other automation tools. So why is this a big deal? So as you know, ArcGIS Enterprise runs on top of infrastructure as a service or virtual machines. And so those virtual machines could be on your premises, in a different cloud, or Azure. So what's the big deal, really? The big deal is that Azure comes with a fair bit of learning curve with it. There's concepts such as resource groups, load balancers, virtual networks, configuring the firewalls, dealing with certificates, and understanding some of the Azure terminology like availability sets, integrating with things like Key Vault. So depending on your expertise and your level of experience with Azure, you may be familiar with it or you may not. So our objective really is to simplify all of that, and so you don't have to worry about a lot of these details and can be up and running really quickly. So what is Cloud Builder? So for those of you not familiar, so Cloud Builder is a desktop application for Windows. its elevator pitch is that it is a wizard-driven experience that provides you, that can let you achieve your deployment workflows and your post-deployment workflows. And you will see this in demos throughout my talk. And along with that, as ArcGIS Enterprise becomes more cloud native and cloud friendly, it also allows you to configure with some of the Azure native features. Some examples are Azure managed databases like SQL Azure or Azure SQL Database or Postgres on Azure. There's also integration with Azure Key Vault for like secure storage of secrets and certificates. And then for storing large volumes of data, which most GIS people are familiar with, ArcGIS Enterprise works well with object stores like blob storage. And then active development and some of the newer features include working with the Azure Data Lake Store for your big data analytic workloads and storing those there. And there's also integration with Azure Active Directory for your identity and access control management. So that's really what Cloud Builder gives you, is these integration pieces. Taking a step back, it'll sort of help me set context for some of the workflows that I go through in Cloud Builder. Some of this may be repetitive for some of you, but bear with me through it. So there's some concepts that you need to know before you understand deploying to Azure. And these are concepts that apply in Azure or any other cloud or any other environment. As you have learned to migrate your GIS server to the new paradigm of WebGIS, you're familiar with the different components that are available. Right? So you have the portal for ArcGIS, you have the ArcGIS server, and you have different data stores with which the server works with. So central to all of this really is what is known as the hosting server. You'll also hear references to it as the base deployment, because that's typically what you get started off with your WebGIS. So your hosting server consists of your portal and a server, and that is called the hosting server. And then with recent releases of ArcGIS Enterprise, you've heard about the licensing changes that have happened for role-based servers. So gone are the days when you created a single ArcGIS server site and published all kinds of services on it. Now the recommendation really is to split those workloads, they're licensed separately, and they're deployed separately as well. So each one of these sites serves a particular function. For example, they could be the site that is used to host imagery. So that would be your image server site. Or it could be your site or your deployment that manages your real-time assets. So that would be your GeoEvent site. Similarly, if you plan to run big data analytics, that would be your GeoAnalytics site. Or as you are already familiar with, we already have the generic server deployments which work the same way they used to previously. And then at the bottom tier, you'll see these different data stores, starting with just your relational database stores, your tile caches, the spatiotemporal store for storing observational data, and then other sort of big data file shares and other generic data stores. So if you look at these three tiers, it's really each one of those represents a site or a deployment, and each one is licensed separately, and each one is managed separately, if you will. But they all come together to deliver the functionality that you're used to. Okay. So then we talked about all of these sites. Now, in terms of the actual infrastructure that they run on, you have several options. You can choose to put them on a single machine, or you can choose to spread these components across multiple machines. You could have, say, portal on one machine, the GIS server on another, your data store on another. It really comes down to how many machines do you have available and you're willing to pay for. And then the other sort of splitting these into different tiers, like I just mentioned. You could separate out your portal, your hosting server, the web adapter or reverse proxy, and your data stores. So that's separating these into different tiers. And each of those tiers, in turn, could have one machine or multiple machines, depending on your factors for load, handling scale, and also availability. And then in terms of storage options, those of you familiar with the ArcGIS server administration are familiar with the configuration store, the content store, and also the server directories. In terms of your deployment options in Azure, you can choose to put those on a file share machine, a virtual machine, or you could put some of those assets in Azure blob storage or table storage, or you could choose to use Azure Files, which provides a SMB as a service for you to host those files, if you will. So those are your different deployment options. You can choose to spread your deployment across multiple tiers, have multiple machines per tier, and then you have all these different storage options. I'll go through some of those storage options in more detail in a later slide. So how do I get started? So the first step is, obviously, you'd get an Azure subscription. Maybe your organization already has one. There's also free Azure subscription, free trials. There's many different ways to get Azure these days. So you'll want to get one of those. And then the second one is, and this is something that has not changed, is you will still be procuring your licenses the regular means. You go into My Esri or your accounts, and you download your provisioning file or from there. And then the third one is you'd actually get the ArcGIS Enterprise Cloud Builder. That's how do we do that? Right. The easiest way to do that would be to, the way I do it, is Google search. Cloud Builder. It should take you to our help documentation page, which has links to download Cloud Builder. It's a quick click once application that installs within a matter of seconds. So you can find links from the My Esri site, from our documentation page, and also from the Azure Marketplace as well. So once you download that, once you download and install it, you'll get the application. And with that, I'll switch over to a quick demo of getting started with Cloud Builder. So here I am. I've actually launched the application. I'm also already signed in. I had a bit of a snafu this morning where I forgot my phone at home, and so multi-factor authentication didn't really work, so I had to call my wife and ask her to click the button for me. So that was an interesting exercise. But yeah, so I'm signed in, thankfully, and the demos should all now work. Right? I have all these subscriptions. As you can tell, I'm also the Azure platform lead, so I have a lot of Azure environments I work with. Once you're signed in and you pick the subscription you want to work with, the landing page shows you the list of a catalog of sites that we've already deployed. There's some sites that my colleagues have hosted or things that people have deployed us at the island. You can choose to work with your existing sites and manage them here, do post-deployment operations, delete them, etc. Or you can choose to deploy a new site. I'll walk you through the workflow of deploying a new site. The first thing is you'll get to select, what's the role of this site that I'm trying to deploy? If you remember, I mentioned there's the base deployment or your hosting server, there's the GeoEvent, GeoAnalytics, or image server, or the general purpose GIS server. Typically, with the WebGIS pattern, you want to start off with your base deployment. So you'd pick the first option, which says you're deploying a base enterprise deployment. The next screen is going to ask you some Azure-specific information. The first thing you'll want to select is a resource group. A quick overview of what a resource group is. A very simplistic way to think about it is it's a folder, and you can assign, that's where you organize your assets and your Azure resources. You can assign access control to those resources. So the easiest way to think about it is a folder. And so everything within Cloud Builder, you can create resources within the Cloud Builder itself, or you can create them in, say, the Azure portal and reference them right within Cloud Builder. So I'd pick a resource group. I'll call it UC demo. And you pick a region in which I'm creating this resource group. Right. Just create that. And then the next step is it's going to ask you is to pick the image that you would like to use. Right. In this case, I'm using the latest ArcGIS Enterprise 10.6.1, which actually just went live on Monday. And I will choose the region to which I want to deploy this enterprise site. And all of the 54 different regions should be listed, so you can pick that. You can also, there's also a setting option where you can, if you're working in a particular region, you can actually choose that default region. So Cloud Builder will remember that settings. The next option is an advanced scenario where imagine your organization requires you to have to meet specific security requirements, like it needs an antivirus running as part of these machines, or you want to have some data that's loaded as part of these machines. That's when you would take one of our images, customize it, add to it, and save it as an image, and then you can reference it within Cloud Builder to deploy. So we do support custom images as well. The next step it's going to ask you for is the domain with which you want to access this new deployment. So I'm going to say UC demo 2. and it's luckily available. So this needs to be unique, and needs to be unique in the Azure region that you're picking. And so I provided a unique name, and that's going to be the URL by which I access my sites. The next set of options is, remember I explained about the different deployment options you have, whether you want to use a single machine, multiple machines, you want to use a single tier of machines or multiple. This one is basically allowing you to choose that. Right? So I'll leave the default with single for now, and then we'll come back to some of the more advanced scenarios. And then the next step. Remember, I mentioned that nothing has changed in terms of ArcGIS licensing in the cloud. You're still procuring your licenses from the My Esri site. And then in my case, I've already downloaded it here. I'm going to browse out to my portal license and my server license. I'm going to provide some information that's needed for the deployment. So right now I'm providing what's known as the primary site administrator credentials. And then this is the Windows credentials for the ArcGIS service account. So the ArcGIS services that run as Windows services. This is the service account that is used. Then in order for Azure to provision a machine, you actually need a administrator account. And so I'm providing credentials for that. And then the next option is going to ask me, since this is a single machine deployment, I can choose what type of machine I would like. In this case, it's actually going to go out and get all of the machine sizes that are available in that region. So you can pick and choose based on your license and your needs. You can leverage the elasticity of the cloud and really scale as demand grows. You can pick your type of machine, how many cores and how much memory you would like it to have. You can choose the size of the operating disk, your C drive. You can choose to add an additional disk to the machine. And you can choose to, what size you would like for that machine, going all the way up to like 4 terabytes. You can choose the performance you want from these disks. You can use regular disks or solid state disks, and you get really good performance using solid state disks. Once you've done that, there's some additional options that are optional to configure. For instance, you can choose the time zone to which to set the server time as, depending on the region you're working with. Another advanced scenario we supported in recent releases is the ability to join your virtual machine to an Active Directory domain. Let's say you're a large enterprise, you happen to be running an Active Directory instance in Azure. You would like those machines to participate. You can actually join it here by providing the domain credentials. And then you can actually choose to name the machine. So Cloud Builder will provide some defaults. You can choose to accept it or provide your own name. A couple more options. You can choose to enable Windows updates. You can choose to enable remote desktop access to those machines and the port on which you'd like to access it. The next set of options is the virtual network. So machines within Azure need to talk to each other, so they're always placed into a virtual network. This is similar to how a machine joins a network within your enterprise. So again, you can reference existing virtual networks or create one right within Cloud Builder as well. Once I've selected all of those, I click Next. There's a few more screens to follow. This one is asking you for the set of options you'd like to enable on the built-in ArcGIS Data Store. As you know, the ArcGIS Data Store has 3 flavors. There's the relational data store for storing like feature data. There's tile cache data store for storing your tile caches. And then there's the spatiotemporal store for storing observational data. And you can choose to enable one or the other depending on your needs. And the next screen is going to ask you some options that are required for Cloud Builder to function. I'll get into more details about what is the deployment artifacts in the under the hood section, if you will. And then the next option is asking you about the storage option you'd like to use. If you remember my slide previously, I said you could put the server config store, the content store on a file share VM, or you can say I want to actually use Azure Storage, and I want to use Azure Files or Azure Blobs. I can choose that. And if you choose that option, you can actually choose that storage account, and again, or create it right within Cloud Builder. Click Next. So the next screen is asking you for an SSL certificate. So typically, if this is a production deployment, you will want to have purchased an SSL certificate from a trusted certificate authority. But if this happens to be a dev test sort of environment, or you're just getting started, you can actually use a self-signed certificate that Cloud Builder will automatically generate. So if you did have, and as a matter of fact, you can actually, as a post-deployment operation, the Cloud Builder can swap out a certificate at a later stage as well. So if you had a certificate, you would export it to a PFX file. You would provide that and the password for that PFX file, and Cloud Builder will install it on the web server machines that you're in your deployment. Once that's done, you get a summary page which describes what you're intending to deploy. You can choose to save that summary. It'll save it out in a text file. This is always handy for you to sort of go back and see what you deployed with. It's also useful if you're have a support ticket with Esri support, and they might ask you for the summary of or what you were trying to do, if you will. So that in a nutshell is how I would deploy the base deployment. Right? So I walked through a single machine based deployment. So if I click finish at this point, in the next 30 to 45 minutes, you will have a fully functional base deployment ArcGIS Enterprise running in Azure that you can access. Right? So now let me walk you through some of the other options we provide. Right? So let's say I didn't really want to put everything on a single machine. Right? I wanted to actually, I'm sensitive to workload separation, and I actually want to spread all these components across multiple machines. So I'd uncheck the single tier machine, and the only change you will see is up here, where basically Cloud Builder now says, okay, so it's not just one machine, there's many machines. Cloud Builder can pick the machine names, the default machine names and sizes, or you can really get specific and provide each one of those. And I'll click specify and click next. This is a bit of a busy screen, but this is actually telling you, all the machines that it will provision, what are the names. You can, again, configure each one of those and pick sizes and, disk sizes for individual VMs. You can choose how many machines you want, depending on the license you have available and your budget. And then you can click next. Right? Everything else remains the same. The only difference you'll see is now in the summary, you'll actually see that this is not a single machine deployment, but actually many, many machines. So that's your base deployment. And so once you have your base deployment, let's take the scenario where, okay, I've got my base deployment. I'm able to publish feature services, map services to it. But I want to do one of these role-based deployments, if you will. Let's imagine I'm trying to deploy an image server at this point. Right? So I'd select the image server option, click next. Everything else sort of remains the same. You'll be asked for a domain name. You'll pick the image. You'll decide whether it's single machine or multiple machines. You'll do the same thing. The difference you'll see is now we're not asking you for your portal license. We're just asking you for your server license. So in this case, I would browse out to my image server license, provide that. And that's about the only change. There's one other change, one other screen that you will see when you're deploying anything other than the base deployment, which is, would you like to federate this site with your base deployment or your portal or not? You can choose to deploy the GIS server standalone and have it not be federated with your portal, or you can choose to actually federate it, in which case I would pick my base deployment. In this case, I think it's this one. I would provide the administrative credentials for the portal, and then I'm ready to go. Since this is an image server, you can actually deploy an image server to do two functions, one or the other or both. You can choose it to be your image hosting server and serve out your imagery, or you could be deploying it as your raster analysis server, right? So where you're actually running analytic jobs against raster data. And let's say you chose one of those options, you can also choose to use a raster data store that lives in cloud storage. So this is where, here's an example of ArcGIS Enterprise and Cloud Builder working with cloud native features. In this case, I'm choosing to say my raster data store, or the output of my raster's analysis, is actually going to live in Azure Storage as blobs. Right? So I can browse out to my storage account. I can create a container and have my raster output go there. Right? Again, same methodology applies here. Cloud Builder, you can create resources or reference existing ones. Everything else remains the same. Right. The only difference is you will now see in your summary page that we are deploying an image server instead of your base deployment. So that was a quick overview of the deployment option. Just spending a couple of minutes on some of the post-deployment operations. So one of the things you can do is within your, after you've deployed, right, I can come in and manage the machines in my site. So in this case, this was a single machine install. I can come in and resize it. I can choose, a larger machine, a smaller machine. I can choose to increase the size of my disk. I can switch it from, solid state drive to a regular disk. I can start and stop machines. I can delete them. And then, so those are some of the post-deployment management operations you can do. Resizing machines, starting, stopping machines, all within Cloud Builder. The next post-deployment operation is adding machines to site. Right? So let's say you had a, maybe let me pick a federated site. Okay, that's an older version, sorry. So let's say I had a deployment and I decided I needed to add more capacity to it. You can actually do that right within Cloud Builder. Again, it would show you the list of existing machines, and in this case, this was a single tier machine, so I can add a secondary machine and make it highly available. So that's an option. If I had a server deployment or a multi-tier deployment, I can choose to add machines to specific tiers. So a lot of flexibility there in terms of being able to add machines to your site. The next option is actually adding data store machines to the site. Right? So just like you could add server machines or a portal machine, you can add data store machines to the site. Like initially, let's say I got started off, right, and I just deployed with the relational data store, and then 3 months later, I decide, okay, you know what, I'm going to be using geoanalytics, so I'm going to need a spatiotemporal data store. So I can come in and say, I'd like to add a spatiotemporal data store. Provide the same set of information that you did during like deployment, and then you can choose how many machines I'd like to use. Is this a cluster of 3 machines for the data store or what? And it'll go ahead and add those machines to your site and configure them. So that's add data store. There's a couple of other options. This one is grayed out. This is actually the ability to register a GeoDatabase with your server. This is an option not on your base deployment, but on anything else. Let me see if there's an option here. Yeah, so here's an example where I can register a database. So this is your classic SDE-based databases, if you will. So as you'll see, we provide 3 different options. The first one is Microsoft Azure SQL Database. So this is essentially the SQL Server flavor of Azure. And it's fully managed, upgraded, managed by Microsoft. It's scalable, elastic. Then we also support Microsoft Azure Database for Postgres. This is new at 10.6.1. Or you can choose to use a SQL Server on a virtual machine. So all 3 are valid options. And the workflow for that is, you would pick the server. Again, if this is SQL Azure, you can provision it within Cloud Builder, or reference it, or reference existing ones. You'd provide some of the credentials that you need to wire this up in terms of the primary site administrator, what's the database administrator and the database user, your SDE user and whatnot. So once you walk through this workflow, it'll actually buddy a database, a GeoDatabase with your server site. So you can do that within Cloud Builder. The next option, as I mentioned, once I've deployed, and actually go ahead and install a CA-issued certificate with using Cloud Builder. So you launch this wizard. It'll ask you to browse for your certificate file, and you provide the password for the certificate file, and it'll go ahead and install that certificate on your server or your web servers. And then the last one is upgrades, which I'll come to in a different demo. Okay, now just giving you some of the highlights that have happened at 10.6 and 10.6.1. The biggest change at 10.6 was our support for automation. And so this is really a big deal because for several organizations, they don't want to be confined to what Cloud Builder gives them. Or they're a large enough IT shop that they actually deploy ArcGIS Enterprise at scale multiple times in multiple environments. So for them, more than a GUI WYSIWYG tool, they actually needed automation. So we added support for automation where I don't know if you noticed at the end of the Cloud Builder on the summary page, you can actually save out your automation artifacts, and then you can use that to deploy within Visual Studio or PowerShell, Azure PowerShell, or using the Azure command line interface, or Azure CLI as it's known, which is actually a cross-platform option that works on Linux, Mac, and Windows. And then we also added support for deploying virtual machines containing ArcGIS Desktop. So we have marketplace images for ArcGIS Desktop. It has Desktop and Pro, so you can deploy those within Cloud Builder itself. Today, Cloud Builder does not license them for you. It is still a manual step. There's some licensing changes that need to happen before those can be automated. And then I highlighted in my demo some of the new features, which was the support for domain joining virtual machines, and then also the support for Azure Files. So Azure Files provides you a managed SMB service for you to host file-based data. And then there was also a bit of a breaking change made between 10.6.1, where we now use the standard context for accessing your servers, known as server and portal. Okay, what's new at 10.6.1? Just fresh out of the oven. I think the big change really has been upgrades, and this really is huge in my opinion. This is as close as you can get to a one-click upgrade of your entire entire ArcGIS Enterprise. So you can upgrade not just standalone GIS servers, but you can even upgrade your entire base deployment and your federated servers. And I'll show that in a later demo. We also added support for Azure Database for Postgres. So this is a service that went generally available a few months ago, and we added support for it. So as you saw in that screen, you can choose between the SQL Azure or SQL Server flavor or the Postgres flavor. These are managed database offerings from Microsoft, and so they manage the infrastructure, the upgrades, and the high availability, all of that for you. And then the other thing that's new at 10.6.1 is we actually added documentation for how you'd configure enterprise logins using Azure Active Directory. So this is one of the most highly asked questions at the island. We were unable to automate it within Cloud Builder, but we did the next best thing is we actually provided the steps for you to actually do that in the Azure portal and the ArcGIS Enterprise administrative pages. It's reasonably straightforward. It's about a 15-minute to 30-minute process. I think the documentation will really help people configure this. We're seeing a lot of people, migrating workloads to Azure, and then they're sort of migrating their users and their identities into Active Directory, and they'd like it to work seamlessly with the enterprise as well, ArcGIS Enterprise. So that's a key good feature. So I'll just touch base on automation that was new at 10.6. As I mentioned, Cloud Builder gives you it's a wizard-driven experience for you to achieve your deployment workflows. At 10.6, it takes on a new form. It's also now sort of a designer to generate automation artifacts. So this is that summary page that I talked about, and I'd like to draw your attention to the highlighted button over there, where once you walk through Cloud Builder and its wizard, you can choose to click Save Automation Artifacts, and it'll pop up a dialog saying, okay, what do you want this automation to target? Do you want to use Visual Studio? Do you want to use PowerShell or the Azure CLI? You can choose all three. And it'll ask you where to save the file. You provide that. It'll save out a zip file containing all of those artifacts. And you can use those artifacts to deploy using Visual Studio. If you're a developer and have experience there, you can deploy using PowerShell or the Azure CLI. So here's basically an example of what those artifacts look like. So what does it really consist of? There's an ARM template. For those of you not familiar, ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager. And an Azure Resource Manager template basically defines or describes all of the infrastructure and the resources that you will be creating. So we generate that for you. And then all of those ARM the information that you provide in Cloud Builder, that gets saved out as template parameters. and that's where all of the information that's different across different deployments is saved. There's the automation that happens within Cloud Builder. So that's some of the artifacts that's needed there. The license file that you provided, that gets copied in there. And then the SSL certificate, either the self-signed one or the trusted certificate, that gets copied into this directory, if you will. So now, which one do I choose? So you just mentioned we got Cloud Builder and you got automation. So really, it is a decision based on simplicity versus power. Cloud Builder, wizard-driven, really simple to use, easy to get started with. Really, you would look at the automation options when you're looking to customize or extend your deployments. So what's an example of customizations people have asked us to do or typically do with this? One is they want to change the name of resources. Right? So Cloud Builder doesn't give you user interfaces for tweaking every one of those, and for good reason. So you can actually use the automation artifacts to tweak some of those. And then another example is I actually, if I'm doing a multi-tier deployment, I actually want to separate out my machines into different subnets, right? So some people try and create a DMZ sort of environment. So Cloud Builder doesn't have a user interface for defining multiple subnets, but you can actually do that through the automation artifacts. Another common feature that people do is they actually integrate the deployment with network security groups. For those of you not familiar with what a network security group, it's sort of a network level firewall where a network administrator can define rules to say which ports and traffic can be allowed on which ports and from which machines. So some of the larger enterprises, they have network security groups that they like to configure. Here's an example of where they would use automation artifacts. The next scenario is also an IT requirement for many large organizations where they integrate with Azure monitoring services like OMS or set up alerts and configure those. Other things that people typically do is configure a virtual machine backup policy as part of deployments and things like schedule maintenance. Really, the options are limitless in terms of that. Like basically anyone looking to leverage new features of Azure that haven't yet come in to Cloud Builder would be looking to customize through this mechanism. There's one caveat though. If you make any edits outside of Cloud Builder, it's kind of assumed that you know what you're doing. So the training wheels are off. So once you start diving into editing those templates and whatnot, you really should know, you should have some experience with Azure and know what you're doing. And then the next big feature is, once you have this automation, it really comes to life in terms of being able to integrate with these different systems for continuous integration and CI/CD, as it's known as, continuous integration and continuous deployment. There's all these different subsystems, different popular infrastructure management systems. You can now integrate ArcGIS Enterprise on Azure deployments into one of these. Right? And then, last but not least, we also have an option where with these automation artifacts, you can actually deploy right within the Azure portal itself using the Azure Cloud Shell. So the Azure Cloud Shell is a browser-based interface which comes preloaded with the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell. So using our artifacts, you can deploy right within there. Right. So in the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip the automation demo. Or no, actually I'm going to spend a quick second on it. I'm going to actually use Cloud Builder to save out the artifacts. I'm going to actually show you what those artifacts look like within Visual Studio. Right. So Cloud Builder saved out those artifacts. I unzipped it. It gives you a solution file that I launch in Visual Studio. And right within Visual Studio, I can choose to deploy this deployment. And now I'm within the user experience of Visual Studio, where I'm picking the Azure subscription. I'm picking the resource group. Here's the template. Here's the parameters that I provided in Cloud Builder. All of those got populated and saved here. And all I'm going to do is click deploy. Actually need to choose a deployment storage account. And I'll explain what that is in a minute. And click deploy, and it's off to the races. A similar experience within Azure CLI and PowerShell. We have entry point scripts, which you would run, and it would just automatically deploy your entire enterprise site. So this one is definitely worth a demo. So this was new functionality at 10.6.1, and which is upgrades. So the prior story with ArcGIS Enterprise Cloud Builder was you would use a specific version of Cloud Builder for every version of ArcGIS Enterprise. So if you wanted to deploy 10.5, you would get the 10.5 Cloud Builder and deploy using that. And that still remains the story. The only difference is now Cloud Builder will actually show you sites from a prior version as well. So in this case, I have the 10.6.1 Cloud Builder, as you can see from the title bar, and I have some older sites. In this case, this was actually a 10.6 site. Oops, if I move my mouse. And one thing you'll notice, all of the post-deployment operations are disabled. If you wanted to do post-deployment operations, you would use the 10.6 version of it. But since you're within 10.6.1, you really need to upgrade this site to the current version before you can do some operations. So I'll click the upgrade deployment. So one thing about this deployment is it wasn't just a single site. It was actually a base deployment within your portal, your hosting server, a data store, all of that. And I also had this separate GIS server. I can't remember if it was an image server or not, but it basically had some machines within that as well. So it was a multi-machine site there. And then I provide the virtual machine administrator credentials. This is used to provision a temporary VM which has the new image bits and sort of orchestrates your deployment. So I provide that. Click next. Now I'm going to browse out for the license for my new version. In this case, let's imagine this is 10.6.1. Since I'm upgrading portal server, I provide that. Again, information that's needed to complete the workflow. The same set of credentials with the primary site administrator, the ArcGIS service account. Next. Deployment artifacts, which is needed for Cloud Builder to function. I'll talk a little bit about what that is. Click next. So it asks me for my portal and server license for my base deployment. Now it's asking me for the license for the image server that I had. Provide that. Click next. And that's it. You get a summary page which describes what's going to happen. And basically, once you click, again, we even support the ability to automate your upgrades as well. So if I were to say, click Save Automation Artifacts, we'll generate the scripts, the templates, and all of that you can use to run the upgrade, sort of outside of Cloud Builder as well. And then you can click Finish. And what it's going to do is actually, it's going to do an in-place upgrade of all of the components, all of your different machines that have ArcGIS software. So it's going to upgrade all of the software and all instances, data stores, portal, ArcGIS server. And it's not just that one site. You could have your base deployment with many different federated sites. It will actually upgrade those in the right sequence. There's a particular sequence of upgrades, if you will. Do you mind if I take questions at the end?
Is there a rollback?
No, there is no rollback, right?
Because then I need a backup.
Yeah, so I'll get to where backups come in and where we're planning to work on that. Slides. Okay, so just to give you some real value from this session, it really helps to understand how Cloud Builder works under the hood. So if you do run into trouble, it'll help you to sort of troubleshoot. So Cloud Builder in a sense has two responsibilities. One is to provision infrastructure resources, and so that is that ARM template and the ARM resources that I mentioned. And then the second one is to trigger the configuration of all of those ArcGIS components, right? For those of you who've administered or deployed ArcGIS Enterprise, you're aware of the functionality to create the site, license it, configure all the directories. So that's all the ArcGIS configuration with respect to firewalls and all of those rules, if you will. So Cloud Builder is really responsible for these two things, right? So the first thing it does is with the ARM template, it provisions all of those Azure infrastructure resources. And those consist of virtual machines, the network interfaces that attach to those machines, the disks that you configure through Cloud Builder. It configures those. And then if you're deploying many machines, they'll put them in availability sets to make them more highly available. They'll deploy the load balancers to route traffic to those machines. It'll create virtual networks, etc. Right? So all of these infrastructure resources get defined in the ARM template and get created through Cloud Builder. And then the next step, and this is where that deployment storage account will start to make sense, is Now that those machines are up, they need access to those artifacts, your license file, the SSL certificate, and they need the automation artifacts in order to configure themselves. So Cloud Builder or the automation will actually put those in that deployment storage account for you. And then the last thing it will do is it'll actually start the deployment of the ARM template, right? So if you were using the Azure CLI, the command it would run is AZ, which stands for Azure Group Deployment Create. It would give you the template file and the parameters file and say deploy. If you're using PowerShell, it will use this commandlet to deploy, if you will. And basically, Cloud Builder sort of invokes one of these under the hood. So those are the 3 steps that happen. Some tips and tricks for you to navigate some of this as well. On one of my prior slides, I talked about the storage options and where you'd want to place your config store, your content store. You had the option of using a file share machine. You had the option to use Azure blobs and tables, or you could use an SMB service. Right? So here's some of the considerations you'll want to take into consideration. There's latency, performance, scalability, and support, right? And high availability. And each one of these, each one of these options shines in one characteristic but not the other. So there is a bit of a trade-off in terms of which one you choose. Right? For instance, if I pick the file share machine, I get really good latency, really good performance. I can size my disk. I can give it additional throughput. I can put all of my content, config store, all of that supported. The only thing is it's a single machine file share. So a single machine file share in Azure gives you a 99.9% SLA. You could couple that with sort of scheduled maintenance, so you have some control over when that machine gets taken down for maintenance. So you could combine that to get some level of HA. The other 2 options do give you highly HA options, but for example, in the Azure blob and table options, you can't really put server directories on there today. So those are some of the trade-offs you'll want to think about. Azure Files is an interesting option. Today it has some throughput limits and some performance limits today. The Azure Files team is working hard to increase some of those limits, and in the coming weeks you will actually see things like the scalability go up from 1,000 IOPS to 10,000 IOPS, and some premium options as well. So there's a few options to keep in mind. Then what happens if you have deployment failures? So some tips is, the first thing is, as I mentioned, everything is a deployment, gets logged within Azure under that resource group. So you'll want to examine the deployment in the Azure portal and look for any messages that might give you a clue. You'll want to examine the log files for errors. So Cloud Builder generates a log file on its machine and also a log file for what happened on the cloud machines. So you'll want to look at those and see if you can look for errors. One thing that has tripped up many customers in prior releases, and this is something that's gotten better at 10.6.1, is you'd want to provide strong passwords for the Windows credentials. We've had many customers report deployment failures because the credentials they provided for the ArcGIS service account was not strong enough, and so their deployment, Windows would reject that and your deployment would fail. And then typically you'll want to start off with the defaults and small deployments, right? And once you have some confidence and success with that, you'll want to actually scale up to a larger deployment, right? So start small. And then if none of that works, you obviously would submit a support incident ticket with Esri support, and they will typically ask you for the log files and a deployment summary so they can help you navigate those errors. So to sort of wet your whistle and give you a thing for what's planned ahead. So we did upgrades, but as the gentleman mentioned, is what about rollback and what about what happens if my upgrade fails, right? So we were not able to get that into the 10.6.1 release, but our plan is to work on that for 10.7, which is prior to upgrades, you'll actually be able to configure backups at a virtual machine level back to the Azure Recovery Services vault. And so that way you would actually be able to roll back to a prior version as well. And then, as I mentioned, today one of the typical customizations people make is integrating with monitoring, right? So they want to use some of the cloud monitoring tools like Azure Monitor or Log Analytics. So we want to actually enable that right within Cloud Builder to set up that integration. So that way your metrics and your logs, they just go into the central monitoring store, and then you can set up alerting and dashboards, all using cloud tools like in Azure. And then the last but not the least is we actually want to give another entry point, which is to make our solution templates and our ARM templates available on GitHub, so people can just access them directly from Git and run those templates right within either Azure Cloud Shell or within automation in their CI/CD pipelines. So with that, a little housekeeping task. Please take the surveys using your apps. We do read all of your feedback, and that's how we improve. So with that, I'll open up for questions.
When you selected the SQL Server as data store, I think I was taking notes and missed something. Did the SQL Server instance have to already exist, or when you selected it, did it create it?
Right. So the question was, in the register enterprise GeoDatabase workflow, does Cloud Builder create a new SQL server on a VM, or can I reference an existing one? And so the answer is it can actually reference an existing one. The only caveat, the only requirement is that when you walk through the wizard, you just give it the same name. So basically the way Cloud Builder works is if it identifies a resource, it will not create it. So if I happen to have a virtual machine in my network with that name, it will not create it. It'll just attempt to configure it.
Okay, and then if it doesn't exist,
it'll create it. Right? And within Cloud Builder, you can choose the version of SQL Server to use and the image and the size and all of that.
Follow-up question, Enterprise GeoDatabase. Of the options for that listed through your demonstration, do you have performance metric data to help us choose the right option?
Okay, so the question was for the Enterprise GeoDatabase options. So we have three. We have Azure SQL Database, which is the SQL Server flavor. We have Postgres, and we have SQL Server on a VM. And so the question was, do we have performance metrics and some guidance to say which ones to choose? And the unfortunate answer is no, we do not. But one thing I would want to suggest is take advantage of the elasticity of the cloud. Everyone's workloads are different, so we can't recommend a one-size-fits-all. But really, the beauty of the cloud is you combine it with the elasticity and the monitoring. So you would actually deploy something, use the monitoring tools, watch what's happening, and then you can actually scale elastically. For instance, in the Azure SQL Database, it's known as provision throughput or DTUs. You can basically elastically scale that on demand or based on your observed workflow. So we don't have any guidance or white papers to help you there. It would be more an effort on your part.
Thank you very much. A follow-up question then is there logic built into the deployment such that the Azure cloud infrastructure is aware of what we're using for our deployment and making sure that latency between that enterprise GeoDatabase host and our enterprise hosting is optimized.
Right. Okay, so the question was, are there any safeguards within Cloud Builder to ensure that what I'm deploying isn't a bad configuration in terms of latency and performance? So one of the things Cloud Builder adheres to is it'll only show you resources within the region to which you're deploying. So in that first screen, I actually picked the region to which I was deploying my servers or my enterprise. It will only show you resources within that region. So you will never be able to pick a region that's in, say, East Asia or whatever, because we know that the latency and performance would really suffer. So we never let you do that within Cloud Builder. Right? So that's one of the safeguards we have there.
Thank you.
Right, sure. Next question.
Have you planned to go to Cosmos DB or some nodes as well?
Right. There's no plans to support Cosmos DB and the ArcGIS Enterprise level. The level of support for spatial in Cosmos DB is limited, especially in terms of non-point data. So there's no plans to use Cosmos as either a spatiotemporal data store or a relational data store at this point. Right. Gentlemen.
During Cloud Builder, is there a way to compare the cost between a single machine or multi-machine or adding cores or RAM?
Right. Okay, so the question was, does Cloud Builder provide you a pricing estimate to compare different deployment sizes and types? So I know this is a frequently asked question. Can Cloud Builder give me a pricing estimate? Unfortunately, this is a very complicated topic to solve because for those of you who worked with Microsoft licensing, your cost will vary. It's a virtual machine that you see listed in the Azure portal may cost this gentleman X dollars, and this gentleman something else based on enterprise agreements, the region that you're in, your existing enterprise agreements. So actually to associate a price with a virtual machine resource or even any resource within Azure is actually unreliable just for this one reason. So which is why we have no plans to integrate a pricing calculator or an estimator within Cloud Builder. So your best guidance would be to use the tools that Microsoft provides in their pricing calculator and sort of mimic what you're deploying within Cloud Builder.
So to follow up to that, is there a plan for Esri to say on Azure's pricing webpage, we want to build like the minimum recommended server setup?
Right. So the question was, are there any plans for Esri to provide guidance on the, let's say, for example, the Azure Marketplace, right? Are there any recommended sizes? Again, this sort of ties back to the earlier gentleman's question, which is, what's an ideal size for your GIS server deployment? And to be honest, we don't know. It depends on the workload you're bringing to the table. So in terms of, if you look at the Marketplace and our listing, it's a bring your own license listing. There are some recommended sizes, but those are just generic sizes. And then if you look at the plethora of VM sizes, I mean, there's new VM sizes coming out literally every day and every week. And some of those VM sizes are tuned for specific workloads. Some are good for I/O, some are good for network, some are good for running local compute. So again, there's really no one size fits all that we could recommend. What I would want to focus on is take advantage of the cloud monitoring tools, the fact that you can see how your workload is performing, and then use the elasticity of the cloud where you can say, okay, my instance, I'm not having good performance, I'm going to scale this instance up. Right? So you can do all of those things in the cloud as opposed to like a physical data center. Yep. So.
Yeah, can you talk about who is responsible to keep the always page level up to date? And also, let's say the impact to the ArcGIS application.
Right.
And who is going to be responsible to apply ArcGIS fixes? And if the customer not doing that, what is the process for the customer to be notified to run the regression?
Right. Very good question. So the question is, whose responsibility is it for managing patches at an operating system level, the ArcGIS server application level, and whatnot? And can Esri provide some tools to help with that? And so the answer today is, so we ship an image, and the image comes in, was baked at a certain period of time, had a certain set of Windows updates already available at that time, and then we install the ArcGIS server on that. And then as you saw through Cloud Builder, one option you have is you can enable Windows updates. And so basically Windows updates will be applied based on the configuration within the Windows virtual machine, which typically, as I understand it, like installs it at like 3 a.m. on Sundays or something like that. So it can keep your operating system patched and ready, right? The second part of that question is, what about ArcGIS server patches and upgrades? ArcGIS server patches. Today, our recommendation is, today our only support is it's manual. You'll have to actually RDP to the machine and install those patches. We do have some utilities, within Enterprise which show you available patches, but today that is only shown within the virtual machine. One of the things we're looking at, as I mentioned, is as we integrate with OMS through the monitoring, there's a nice solution called patch management, which allows you to actually push out patches to your infrastructure and your VMs. So we're looking at that as a possible way to sort of deploy ArcGIS patches as well. So with patch management in Azure, you can actually manage operating system level patches and also application patches as well.
So what happened is that recently outside ArcGIS, there's a critical security patch,
Right.
which impact ArcGIS.
Right.
And older version. So those kind of things might impact customers.
Right. So the gentleman was just highlighting that previously a security patch that got rolled out at the infrastructure level sort of broke ArcGIS, if you will. And so that's always a moving target. And these days with the world of security and security patches being rolled out frequently, you kind of have to keep your eye on that. And so that's one scenario where you probably want to set up like a staging environment where you roll out patches and observe behavior, and then roll it out to your production environment. So yeah, I don't have a really great answer, but solution. I can probably take a couple more questions. Could you repeat that, please?
Oh, my question is, how about older versions? So
Uh-huh.
for example, we have a still 10.5 or 10.3, because this system limitations, so we cannot upgrade. So how we migrate those?
So upgrades within Cloud Builder, and I should have called that out, is we are supporting upgrades only from 10.6 and above. And the reason for that is that breaking change we made from 10.5.1 to 10.6, which is why we could not support older versions. So today, if you had an older version, you would actually have to manually remote desktop to the machine, copy the installers over, and run the installer. I mean, so it's a workflow that you do today, but it's not supported within Cloud Builder. So it's a manual step. Right? So one more question. There was a gentleman in the back.
Yeah, in Cloud Builder, you get the option of picking the size of your server. Is there some intelligence built in that it can tell what type of size of server you're working on, or do you need to know that ahead of time?
Right. Yeah. So the question is, can Cloud Builder, based on maybe the type of deployment, if it can pick, some recommended sizes? No, today it sort of defaults to a certain set. Again, I sort of want to just bring back, it's extremely hard for us to make a recommendation on a particular size because it really depends on the workload that you're bringing. And GIS workloads are so diverse, right? Some of them, are accessing file stores. Some of them are accessing, relational databases. So you really need to identify, where is my workload heavy and what's a good instance to map to that, right? So maybe one area of thought is you say, do I need more memory or do I need more CPU or do I need more I/O? Right, so that'll help guide, which family of virtual machines to use. Some of those are optimized for fast I/O. Some of them have larger memory. Some of them have faster CPUs. So sort of guide yourself based on that. So with that, I'll stick around. I have some business cards here, and me and my colleagues we're available at the island to take more questions if you will. All right, thank you.